My wife lied about miscarrying our baby to cover her affair, so I quietly collected proof and left her to face the fallout alone. I'm a 32-year-old guy, and I thought my life was perfect with Sarah. We'd been married for 3 years, and from the moment we met, I felt like she was the one person who made everything make sense. I had a stable job that I enjoyed, a life that wasn't perfect but was mine. And now, with Sarah by my side, I felt like I could handle anything. We had finally decided it was time to start a family. And I couldn't have been happier imagining our future together. Every weekend, we'd pore over baby names, debating middle names and nicknames like it was some sacred ritual only the two of us shared. I still remember the Saturday morning when we picked out the color for the nursery, a soft, calming gray with hints of yellow, and I could see Sarah's eyes light up with excitement. We went to every doctor appointment together, holding hands in the waiting room, laughing at the small talk and celebrating the little milestones. Even when the ultrasound technician laughed at how active our little one was, I felt the swell of pride and love I'd never experienced before. Sarah had this way of making me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Her devotion was almost tangible, and I never doubted her. I told my friends that she was the most honest, grounded person I had ever met, and I truly believed it. I trusted her completely, maybe more than I should have, but it felt natural, like breathing. And yet, there were tiny moments I brushed off. Sometimes she'd be distracted mid-conversation, her phone vibrating in her hand, a look of worry flickering across her face before she quickly smiled and changed the subject. Once or twice, she canceled a casual brunch with friends, saying she was tired or had work deadlines. I convinced myself it was stress, fatigue, nothing serious, nothing to worry about. But even as I reassured myself, a small, nagging feeling settled in my chest, a whisper of doubt I didn't want to acknowledge. I kissed her that night as we stood in the empty nursery. Soft morning light streaming through the curtains, and I thought, this is happiness. This is everything I ever wanted. I didn't know that in the coming months. That sense of perfect bliss was about to shatter. I remember the morning Sarah told me she was pregnant like it was etched into my memory forever. I was brewing coffee, half asleep, when she came into the kitchen with that radiant, almost nervous smile I'd seen countless times before. She held the little test in her hands, shaking slightly, and I felt my stomach drop, not with fear, but with pure, overwhelming joy. "We're going to have a baby," she whispered, and I could barely speak, my hands trembling as I reached out to hold her. In that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. It was just us, and the tiny life that would soon change everything. The next few weeks were a blur of appointments, ultrasounds, and planning. I watched her glow in ways I hadn't anticipated, how she would carefully research the best prenatal vitamins, how she'd fuss over her diet, and how she'd rest whenever she could. I found myself sitting beside her in waiting rooms, holding her hand, feeling the rhythm of her heartbeat as if it were my own. Each appointment felt like a new chapter, a reassurance that our family was truly beginning. We laughed at names, debated whether the nursery curtains should be gray or a soft cream, and sometimes just sat in the empty room, imagining the first cries and tiny feet. But alongside that joy, I noticed the subtle shifts. She would sometimes glance at her phone and stiffen, or her smile would flicker just for a second when a message arrived. She became preoccupied, distracted in moments where I expected her full attention. At first I dismissed it as stress work, pregnancy hormones, the sheer weight of change, but the feeling in my gut told me something was off. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on decorating the nursery, assembling the crib, and folding tiny clothes with trembling excitement. One afternoon, while we were at a checkup, the nurse complimented her on her calm demeanor, and she laughed softly, nodding, yet there was a flicker of unease in her eyes I couldn't place. I squeezed her hand, whispering, "Everything's going to be perfect, just you and me." She smiled. But there was a hesitation that lingered longer than I wanted it to as we left the clinic. I felt a strange mix of elation and unease. I was in love, thrilled, and terrified all at once. I just didn't know that what should have been the happiest time of my life was already quietly starting to unravel. Thread by invisible thread, it all came crashing down one rainy evening. Sarah sat across from me at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug. I could see the tears welling up before she even spoke. I lost the baby," she said, her voice trembling. My chest tightened, my stomach dropped, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The words hit me harder than anything I'd ever felt. I reached across the table, gripping her hands, trying to ground us both. "It's okay. We'll get through this," I whispered. Though inside I was breaking, I watched her crumble into sobs. Shaking and fragile, and I felt this fierce, protective urge to do everything I could to ease her pain. I rubbed her back, murmured reassurances, and told her I loved her. Friends and family called immediately, offering support. I played the role of the devastated husband, comforting Sarah as though the weight of the world rested on our shoulders. Every hug, every tear shed, every whispered "I'm so sorry" felt authentic, except for the nagging unease I couldn't shake. Something didn't sit right. Over the next few days, inconsistencies began to emerge. She couldn't remember dates, or she would contradict details of how and when it happened. The hospital visits she claimed to have attended seemed vague in her retelling, and the timeline didn't quite add up. I hesitated, unsure if I was being paranoid. The grief was real, and I wanted to trust her. But the voice in the back of my mind whispered that not everything was as it seemed at night. I lay awake, listening to her breathing, replaying conversations in my head. "Are you sure you want to talk about it now?" she'd asked once, and I noticed a slight edge in her tone. I convinced myself it was just fatigue and shock. But a part of me was beginning to feel the first prickles of doubt. Then came the first small but undeniable sign. I noticed her phone light up with a message notification while she was in the other room. The brief glance I caught showed a name I didn't recognize. She quickly hid it, laughing nervously when I questioned her. Something in my gut screamed that the miscarriage might not be the whole story. I wanted to ignore it, to believe in her honesty, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. It was starting to grow. The doubt gnawed at me constantly after that. I replayed every conversation, every missed appointment, every small oddity. And the inconsistencies began to pile up like bricks in my chest. Sarah still cried in my arms, still leaned on me for comfort, and on the surface, everything seemed the same, but I couldn't ignore the subtle cracks forming beneath the facade. Her phone was always just a little too close to her chest, her laugh a little too forced when I mentioned the baby. I told myself I was overreacting, that grief made people act strangely, but the nagging feeling wouldn't let go. I started paying closer attention. I noticed she would sometimes step away abruptly during calls or hide her screen when someone messaged her. There were little things like the way she'd check the mirror before answering a text, or how she'd occasionally leave the room to get some water, only to be gone far longer than necessary. Each incident was minor, almost laughable if I looked at it logically. But together they felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't yet understand. One evening, while we were supposed to be folding the nursery clothes, I saw her phone buzz on the counter. The name flashing on the screen was unfamiliar, and for a fleeting second, her face went pale. She quickly grabbed it and smiled, brushing it off with a joke about a coworker needing help with a project. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but my gut tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to rationalize, telling myself it was paranoia. She'd been under stress, hormones running wild, the trauma of the miscarriage, it all could explain these odd behaviors. But there were moments when her eyes would dart away from mine during conversation. Her tone subtly defensive, her laughter tinged with anxiety. The trust I once had felt fragile, like a thin glass, ready to shatter, by the time I went to bed that night. Lying beside her in the dark, I felt both grief and unease choking me. I loved her more than anything, but a seed of suspicion had taken root, and I could feel it growing with every passing day. Something wasn't right in deep down. I feared I was about to uncover a truth I wasn't ready to face. I started noticing patterns that made my stomach twist in knots. The little inconsistencies weren't so little anymore. They formed a web I couldn't ignore. Sarah's excuses for missing calls or suddenly leaving the room became more frequent, and her laughter, once warm and spontaneous, now felt rehearsed. There was a rhythm to her secrecy, almost like she was protecting something from me, and the thought that she might be hiding more than I could bear gnawed at me relentlessly. Then came the message that shook me. I glanced at her phone one evening when it lit up on the counter, and there it was. A text from a man I didn't recognize. It was short, casual, but there was an intimacy in it that made my chest tighten and my hands shake. "Can't wait to see you later?" That simple line, so innocuous at first glance, felt like a punch to the gut. I froze, unsure if I had imagined the words, unsure if my mind was playing tricks. But the look on her face when she realized I'd seen it panic, a flicker of guilt confirmed my worst fears. I tried to confront her casually, asking about her day, about work, anything to see how she'd respond. She smiled, a little too brightly, and waved off my questions with an awkward laugh. But the tension under her skin betrayed her. I began to realize this wasn't just a lapse in judgment or stress. It was intentional. And it made me feel sick to think I had been blind to it for so long. My thoughts spiraled. Every late night at work, every sudden errand, every unexplained expense flashed through my mind like warning signs I'd missed. I began documenting everything in secret, taking mental notes of her schedule, her habits, the little slips she couldn't hide. The excitement and happiness that had filled our home only weeks ago was now tainted with suspicion and fear. By the time I lay down that night, heart pounding, I knew I had reached a point where ignoring it was impossible. The truth was there, just out of reach, and I was determined to find it. I just didn't know yet how devastating it would be, or how it would change everything. I thought I knew about Sarah. I decided I couldn't leave it to chance anymore. If there was a truth Sarah was hiding, I needed proof, something concrete, undeniable. Quietly, I began my investigation, meticulously piecing together the fragments of her life that didn't add up. I backed up her phone data when she wasn't looking, saved every suspicious message, and started comparing receipts and calendar entries. Every little discrepancy was a breadcrumb, leading me down a path I wasn't sure I wanted to fully explore, but couldn't resist. I started noticing patterns that made my stomach churn. Late-night texts, work meetings that didn't exist, short excuses that didn't match the timeline of the miscarriage she claimed. I'd overhear snippets of phone calls when she thought I wasn't paying attention, and small details she mentioned out of habit contradicted what she told me about the past few months. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was enough to make the picture emerge slowly, and it terrified me. One evening, stumbled across the first undeniable proof. Hidden among her messages were photos innocuous at first glance, but with enough context to reveal the depth of her deception. Seeing them, I felt my chest tighten, my hands clammy, my mind racing. The betrayal was bigger than I ever could have imagined. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, trying to reconcile the woman I loved with the person staring back at me in those images. Despite the shock, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Grief and anger coexisted, but there was clarity now. I knew the truth, and with it came control. I didn't need to confront her immediately. I could plan, observe, and collect everything I needed to ensure there would be no denial. No gaslighting, no escape from the consequences. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept my eyes open while Sarah slept beside me. Unaware that I knew, I felt a strange mixture of heartbreak, rage, and empowerment. Everything was about to change, and I had finally stepped off the edge of naive trust. What I didn't know yet was how far I would have to go to protect myself and how much it would cost us both by now. I had reached a point where every interaction with Sarah felt like walking on a knife's edge. I couldn't confront her not yet until I had all the pieces lined up perfectly. She was becoming more controlling, more manipulative, in subtle ways I had ignored before. Little digs disguised as concern, casual remarks questioning my memory, and tiny emotional traps designed to make me doubt myself. I felt like I was living in a house full of mirrors, where reality bent around her words and actions, but I refused to be fooled any longer. I began recording conversations without her knowledge, capturing her half-truths and contradictions. I meticulously saved screenshots, compared timestamps, and cross-referenced locations. Each new piece of evidence was like adding another brick to a wall I was building, a wall between her lies and the undeniable truth. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the miscarriage story was just the tip of the iceberg. A carefully crafted lie to hide something far worse. Her behavior grew more erratic. She would flinch when I approached her phone, avoid my gaze when I casually asked questions, or laugh nervously when I mentioned minor details. I started noticing patterns, certain names appearing in her texts that she would never admit to knowing. Times she claimed to be at work that didn't match what I found online. Subtle signs of emotional intimacy with someone outside our marriage. It was like watching a puzzle slowly assemble itself. The picture was ugly. Even with the evidence piling up, I struggled with the emotional weight. Part of me wanted to run, to leave, but another part stayed, obsessively ensuring I had proof she couldn't deny. Every night, I lay awake listening to her breathing. The house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, imagining what would happen when the truth finally came out. I knew confrontation would be inevitable, but I also knew I had the upper hand now. By the time I closed my eyes that night, the plan was forming in my mind. I wasn't going to cry, beg, or plead. I would let her lies collapse under the weight of undeniable proof, and I would leave her to face the consequences alone. The storm was coming. I was ready, though I had no idea just how far the fallout would reach. The next day, I found the final piece of the puzzle, the one that would leave no room for doubt. Hidden deep in her phone, messages and photos confirmed everything I had feared: the affair, the months of lies, and the cruel deception about the miscarriage. The texts weren't vague or ambiguous. They were intimate, casual, and undeniable. I felt my chest tighten, my hands shake, and my stomach churn as the full weight of her betrayal hit me. The woman I loved, the one I had envisioned a life and family with, had built a secret life while I mourned a loss that never happened. I stared at the evidence for hours, unable to look away. The shock was a sharp, piercing ache, but beneath it was something else: clarity. I finally understood why she had been distant, distracted, and evasive. Every late-night text, every canceled appointment, every suspicious excuse, it all made sense now. And with that understanding came an almost cold determination. I wasn't going to explode in confrontation. I wasn't going to beg or scream. I would let the truth speak for itself. Even as I felt the anger rising, I reminded myself to stay calm. I documented everything meticulously, backed up every message, every photo, every suspicious note. I cross-referenced the timeline of her lies against the miscarriage she claimed, and the deception became brutally clear. The extent of it made my stomach twist. I had been mourning a child that didn't exist, consoling a wife who had betrayed me for months. And yet, I felt strangely empowered, because now I had control. Later that evening, Sarah sat next to me on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a casual smile. I looked at her, the woman who had lied so convincingly, and a cold calm settled over me. I could see the faint flicker of guilt in her eyes, though she tried to mask it. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, knowing the storm was coming, and that soon. She would face the consequences of her lies alone by the time I went to bed. I felt a mix of grief, rage, and grim satisfaction. The truth was mine to wield, and she had no idea how much I knew or how carefully I had prepared. Everything was about to change. I was ready for her downfall. I hit my rock bottom the night everything finally felt unbearably true. I sat on the floor of our bedroom surrounded by stacks of printed messages, bank statements, and photo printouts. The lamp casting a harsh circle of light that made the rest of the room feel like an accusation. My hands trembled as I sorted the evidence dates, times, locations, since all the timeline read like a confession in my own handwriting. I kept thinking about how many times I'd kissed her forehead and promised tomorrow. How many plans we'd whispered into the dark. Each memory now felt like a lie wrapped in a softer voice. "Why are you doing this?" she asked that night from the doorway, her voice small and suddenly fragile. The pleading in it should have broken me, should have undone everything I'd built. But I'd already passed the point where pity could reach me. "Because you deserve to know the truth," I said, and the words landed colder than I expected. She moved closer, eyes glossy. "Please, we can fix this. I'm sorry, let me explain." Her apology was practiced, like every performance she'd given since the miscarriage she'd faked. I shook my head. No, I want you to say it. I want you to say it to my face. She faltered, searching for the lines she'd used before to manipulate, to redirect, to make me doubt myself. The house smelled faintly of her perfume and the coffee I'd forgotten on the counter. An ordinary domesticity that mocked the chaos beneath it. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant muffled sound of traffic outside. Normal life moving on, while mine unraveled. My chest ached, the physical, sharp pain of betrayal, and something inside me hardened into resolve. After she left the room, I sat back down among the paperwork and realized that grief had consumed me for nights. But this was different. This was acceptance of what I'd been given: proof, clarity, and the terrible knowledge that I had to act. I began drafting the letter I'd leave her. Facts, dates, copies of everything, and a clear statement that I was walking away. I typed it slowly, each sentence a practiced blade. When I finished, I folded the pages and slid them into an envelope, along with a few copies of the worst messages. I didn't want a scene. I wanted the truth to be undeniable, and for her to face it sober, without my pleading softening it. I stood, the floor cool under my feet, and tucked the envelope into my pocket. Dawn was still hours away, and I waited in the dark, listening to her soft, even breathing from the bed where we had once planned a nursery, waiting for the moment I would leave it all behind. I left quietly before the sun had fully risen, moving through the house like a shadow, careful not to wake Sarah. The envelope with all the proof was tucked into the kitchen drawer. The final act in a carefully constructed plan? I paused at the nursery door. The soft gray walls and folded baby clothes staring back at me like a cruel reminder of everything that had been stolen. My chest tightened, but there was no hesitation. I had grieved enough, investigated enough, and now it was time to reclaim my life. Outside, the air was crisp, almost shocking in its normalcy. The streets were quiet, the early morning mist curling around street lamps, and I walked to my car with a calm I didn't fully understand. For months I had been filled with confusion, heartbreak, and suspicion, but now, with the truth firmly in my hands, there was clarity. Sarah had lied about losing a child, had betrayed me while I mourned, and I had the power to leave her to face the consequences alone. I didn't need to scream or confront Hertha. Proof would speak for itself. Later that morning, she woke to her phone buzzing incessantly. Messages from friends and family she hadn't called yet. The envelope waited in the drawer, a silent testament to every lie she'd spun. I imagined the shock, the disbelief, the creeping panic as she realized the extent of her deceit. My heart ached not for her, but for the life I had imagined, for the betrayal, and for the strange satisfaction of justice quietly delivered. I drove away without looking back. The city waking around me, the hum of the engine filling the silence. Every step, every mile felt like shedding an invisible weight I hadn't known I'd been carrying. The rage, grief, and heartbreak were still there, but they were tempered by a sense of control, of power regained. I was leaving behind more than just a home. I was leaving a life built on lies, and I had done it on my own terms. By the time I reached the outskirts of the city, the first real sunlight touched the horizon, and I felt something I hadn't in months: freedom. But even as I let the relief wash over me, I knew this was only the beginning. Sarah would face the fallout. I would have to navigate a new life without the woman I once thought I'd spend forever with. The storm had passed, but its consequences were only just beginning. The days that followed were surreal. I didn't hear from Sarah, not a single call or text, and it felt almost unreal. Friends and family, once so absorbed in the story of our miscarriage, began receiving the truth in fragments, though no one knew I was behind it. Whispers started circulating, subtle questions about her honesty, about the months she had claimed to grieve. I watched from a distance, heart still heavy, as the carefully crafted image she had built began to crumble. I spent the morning sorting through what I would do next with my life. The house I had loved, now a memory tinged with betrayal. It was strange how quickly the weight lifted once I had removed myself from the source of deceit. I allowed myself to grieve fully for the child that never existed, for the trust that had been shattered, and for the life we had imagined together. Yet within that grief, I discovered a quiet strength I hadn't known I possessed. The fallout for Sarah was slow, but inevitable. Friends confronted her, questions she couldn't answer without lying again. Her texts went unanswered, explanations fell flat, and the smiles she had once worn like armor began to falter. She realized too late that the safety net she had counted on, my forgiveness, my trust, was gone. I had left her to face it alone. The weight of her choices was sinking in. In the quiet evenings, I walked through the city streets, feeling the first true sense of autonomy in months. There was sorrow, yes, but also clarity. I had navigated heartbreak, betrayal, and deception, and I had come out intact. Every step forward was a reclamation of myself, a reminder that I could survive even the deepest betrayal. By the time I returned home each night, I felt a subtle sense of hope creeping in, mingled with the lingering sting of heartbreak. The life I had known was gone, but I was learning to embrace the one I could shape for myself. And as the days stretched into weeks, I realized that sometimes, leaving quietly, armed with truth and dignity, could be more powerful than any confrontation. The healing had begun, but the echoes of the betrayal would linger, reminding me of how far I had come. Months later, I finally felt like myself again. Though the scars of what happened were still there, etched into memory, I had rebuilt my life slowly, cautiously, and deliberately. Every decision, every step forward. It's informed by the betrayal I had endured, but also by the resilience I had discovered in myself. I spent evenings alone, reflecting on what I had lost and what I had gained: clarity, independence, and a sense of self I hadn't fully appreciated before. I began focusing on my own goals, my passions that had been pushed aside in the fog of grief and trust. I reconnected with friends, traveled to places I'd always wanted to see, and allowed myself small joys without guilt or worry. There was no rush to find someone new, no pressure to fill the void left by Sarah. Instead, I concentrated on healing, on building a foundation strong enough to support the life I wanted, a life without lies, without manipulation, without betrayal. Every now and then, news of Sarah would reach me through the grapevines, snippets of embarrassment, awkward confrontations with friends, the unraveling of the life she had tried to fake. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing she faced the consequences of her choices alone, just as I had anticipated. It wasn't revenge in the flashy sense. It was the steady, inescapable truth confronting her at every turn, and I didn't need to be present for it. Standing on my balcony one evening, the city lights flickering below me, I realized how far I had come. The grief that once felt suffocating had softened into a memory, sharp but manageable. I had faced the deepest betrayal I could imagine, endured the worst of heartbreak, emerged stronger, wiser, and in control of my own life. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful response isn't confrontation or shouting, it's walking away with clarity, dignity, and the courage to reclaim yourself. I smiled faintly, thinking about the future. It wasn't the one I had planned with Sarah, but it was mine, honest and untangled from lies. The storm had passed, the fallout complete, and for the first time in months, I felt an exhilarating sense of freedom. I was no longer the man defined by someone else's deception. I was my own. And for the first time in years, that felt like everything.